We have a really great show today, and I have an incredibly special, talented guest who I don't know how we're going to. I just said we should make this into a mini series because you just got so much insight. I feel like we can't possibly pack it into 45 minutes, but we'll try at least some of it. And then the rest will have to leave. They can read your book. I've already ordered mine. But Naomi, I will have you introduce yourself in a moment. We're having folks still come into the lunchroom now, and I don't want anyone to miss your intro. So you might see people talking. Hi, Pippa. You might see people talking about food in the chat.
Correct.
This is working lunch, so a lot of times people are eating their lunch while we're talking. So if you are eating lunch, go ahead and pop in the sidebar and let us know what you're having today. Did you eat already, Naomi?
No, I'll have a later lunch. Thanks.
That's what I do after. Hi, James. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about how to deal with an abusive work situation. And I have to say, I read a wonderful article that Naomi wrote about this topic. I was mesmerized. I thought it was fantastic, reached out to you straight away. And then when I did, I found out that you've also just recently published
Mhm.
a book as well. So we have a new author. We've got a link to Naomi's book here, The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Life. And I have a feeling we're going to be talking quite a bit about your book as well, because these topics do go hand in hand. So now that we have some folks here and eagerly listening, Naomi, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me, Deb.
Of
Nice
course.
to see you. Yes, that's right. I've recently written a book, The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Life. And of course, the origin of that has been many of my articles. I've been writing for the Financial Times for a number of years, writing about people's emotional lives in the workplace. And my interest is primarily on the unconscious motivations behind people's behaviors and decisions in the workplace. So I oftentimes talk about those uncomfortable dynamics in the workplace, the strong feelings people have in the workplace, the uncomfortable dynamics of difficult personalities, oftentimes those situations that are not voiced, or it's difficult to articulate, or there simply isn't the time to examine these sorts of dynamics in the workplace. So that's what I write about. I also have to say, by the way, that I'm a psychotherapist. I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years, specializing in work-related problems for some 15 years. So that is really my interest. And of course, you reacted to my latest feature, not my latest feature, but I think earlier this summer, a feature in the Financial Times about dealing with abusive relationships in the workplace. And of course, that triggered our conversation. And that's why I'm here.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you are. We've been chit-chatting about this, and I think this is a great topic, especially because our audience is we have a lot of folks here in HR, and when you're in the workplace and you're feeling that trauma and you're feeling abuse, who do you go to? You're supposed to go to the folks in HR, and I don't know that we all are collectively equipped to deal with it, if I'm being honest, because mental health is not, making sure that you've got your I-9s compliant. I mean, it's not a box you tick. Mental health is a very different, it's a very different dynamic altogether. So I thought that your voice and your perspective, your perspective is what I found very interesting, because you talk about the topics from both angles and not just one. And one of the things that I think is most important to talk about is defining abuse.
Right. Well, I think maybe perhaps the best place, well, abuse is about harm,
Yeah.
really, and harming another person, oftentimes intentionally, but oftentimes also unintentionally and sometimes unconsciously. So it's quite complex. But perhaps the best place to start is where we've picked up, or why you've contacted me in
Yeah.
response to the feature that I've written.
Right. What do you do when you're feeling it,
When you're
feeling you've been abused?
Yeah. Well, oftentimes what I see in my practice, and I think happens quite a lot, is people who are the victims of kind of severe bullying or abuse in the workplace, that they oftentimes internalize that.
Oh, did we lose you, Naomi?
By that is they're at fault. It's difficult for them to be convinced that actually they are being unfairly treated or that they are being harmed. And they come to believe over time that they've done something wrong. They're left feeling oftentimes terribly humiliated, even struggling sort of with feelings of shame, thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And it's that kind of shame and humiliation sometimes that sometimes stops them from even seeking help. So they're so convinced that the badness or the fault lies with them and not with the abuser or the person who's harming them in the workplace. So that's a very difficult dynamic to untangle, to help to convince the individual that the fault lies not with them, but outside of them, because otherwise it can be extremely kind of damaging to the individual. Let me just say that, you can understand that if you think about a child, for example, that's being harmed by their parents, you can understand why it's so difficult to acknowledge that the people that you depend on that are meant to look after you could be harming you. That's a reality that's oftentimes overwhelming for a child and even an adult to comprehend. Psychologically, it becomes a bit more bearable to believe that somehow you're at fault rather than facing the reality that this organization or this person who should be caring for you is in fact harming you. So it's that complex dynamic that's difficult to untangle. So in the first instance, it's quite important to create a, a place of safety for that person where they can really recount and retell, and that perhaps people in HR or another professional or an outsider even can help that person define and gain perspective about the reality, what's actually happening.
I think that that's important conversation because perception is everything. We were talking before the show about how, one person could come up and say, make a wisecrack to someone and they would laugh it off and go on their way. But you make that same wisecrack to someone else and it hurts them and they internalize it and they continue to think about it and they overanalyze it. And is that just the difference in our life experiences is how we handle it?
Well, that's right. I guess that's the other side of the coin, of course, that you have to keep in mind that everybody who comes to work brings with them their unconscious world, their internal world, which includes and involves all their past experiences, especially their experiences in their early family lives. And of course, this is much of what I write about, particularly in this book, but also in many of my articles. So people bring with them to work their perceptions, their experiences, their sensitivities, their mindsets, their preconception. All of this comes with them at work. And of course, this colors their perceptions of events. So, that's why people can respond differently to very similar situations. And that's oftentimes why it's so complex and confusing to navigate.
So then, and the one thing that I took from your article that I think is true across the board is that many people don't talk about it. They just quit. They just leave. And that's devastating because they've left and the people who are still at that workplace may or may not have any idea why they left, or that they were feeling abused in any way. So what do you do in those situations where you can't say that? I mean, is it something that you have to approach proactively?
Well, I think one of the things, particularly in this article that I mentioned, is for some individuals, actually, the best thing oftentimes is to leave. If somebody's being harmed in the workplace and the organization is not stepping in to help or really kind of allowing abusive situation to perpetuate, and that's sometimes the case. Oftentimes, with the individual, the best course is to leave, is to not put oneself in the way of harm's way. So leaving can be a solution, of course, for people who are harmed, and the organization isn't offering them other solutions or helping them in any regard.
I think that's quite common, though, don't you? Where people go to HR and they say, "Oh, you're just being sensitive. He didn't mean
Yeah.
anything by that." And
so I guess, people's experiences have to be taken seriously. And I think oftentimes what happens in the workplace is there oftentimes, because of the nature of work, I guess, there oftentimes isn't the time to examine what is actually happening. And things can be dismissed and brushed aside. Because oftentimes, the abuser, the person causing harm, can be somebody who's also contributes to the company. Oftentimes these are people who can be quite, I don't know, they can be charismatic. They could be the ones who have the big ideas. They can be the ones that company relies on. And the company doesn't want to see these people in a kind of a negative light because they depend on them too. So it's much easier to brush this aside or minimize or dismiss them or say to the person, oh, just let it go. You know how this person is. He's quite difficult. Just get over
he says that to everybody. And, right. But is that okay that he's saying that to everybody? Like and that was one of the things that I found really interesting in your article too, is you're right about that. A lot of times those big obnoxious abusers or bullies they produce. They produce. So it's kind of like, well, we'll let that slide since
That's right.
Did you see his numbers from last week? And
That's right. These people, particularly these extreme, and I say extreme because, they are controlling or narcissistic personalities, they're incredibly productive.
Yeah.
They get things done and companies rely upon them too. So what do you do when you're left with the dilemma that, the person that your employees are complaining about is also somebody that you've come to depend on? It's a dilemma.
That is a dilemma. And I think you're right too, Naomi, that there's a difference between an abusive personality in the workplace and an abusive workplace. Because sometimes the entire culture of a company is built on toxicity, where it's coming from the highest level, where we do what we want, we say what we want, we're entitled, and, and if you don't like it, you can leave. And that is the workplace for many. Sometimes there is a healthy place and it's a healthy company. It's just a manager or a coworker that's bringing this abuse into the situation. So now in that situation, you wouldn't say leave. But what would you? Because I know that you're like, if it's a toxic environment, don't stay. Don't put yourself in the center of the abuse. Take yourself out of the line of fire. However, what if it's a wonderful company and just a bad manager? What would be your advice for that person?
Well, you know what? If it's a wonderful company knows how to keep its employees safe. And of course, safety is really crucial. What does it mean to be safe? So, a wonderful company would kind of participate in removing the individual from that kind of toxic relationship and toxic situation. Now, that shouldn't be difficult because oftentimes that's a bit restructured. That's about restructuring.
Yeah.
And that's fine. In the first instance, oftentimes restructuring is the solution, to remove that person immediately from that toxic individual. But then there's an investigation that's needed because if that person is abusive, so there needs a lot of conversations need to be had about what other people's experiences are.
And when you're going into companies and helping with situations like this, you're having conversations with both the violated and the violator. Those must be very different conversations.
Well, it's very important to have all of these conversations.
Oh, yeah.
With everybody. So, oftentimes I've been called into situations when somebody's been accused of bullying, for example, when in fact, once there's been time for a kind of a more thorough investigation, I wouldn't call it bullying as such, but perhaps that's been the perception. And so a story is told and retold, and then it gains momentum, and then it's kind of hard once a narrative becomes established. It's become very difficult to kind of change that narrative. People are very quick to leap to conclusions and to conclude that these are truths. So kind of questioning or challenging some of these narratives is, I guess, what I do. But it's important to try to come across a narrative. And I think what I'm always looking for is to find enough of a shared reality, a kind of an agreement about what's happening. And once we can do that, then we can begin to solve some of these problems. But as long as one individual feels wrongly accused, it becomes very difficult for them to be anything other than defensive.
Yeah.
And of course, as much as possible, we want to kind of avoid that sort of blame and accusations until we could come to some agreement about actually what is in fact happening here.
And do you think that when it's brought into light, that that there's a positive result, or do you feel like it's more, I can't believe you told on me, or I mean, what's the dynamic after the conversations have been had?
I think my intention is always to open up the conversation so that there's more opportunity for various perspectives, different understandings, and from that, an opportunity for more solutions. So the more we can widen the perspective and understand what's happening, oftentimes to try to understand things a bit more systemically. But oftentimes it's not to do with one person. Sometimes it is, but not always. So we want to understand these dynamics in a wider context. And when you can understand these dynamics in a wider context, then it doesn't feel so blaming. It's not so accusatory. This is just, the situation. And with that wider perspective, sometimes people can step back a bit, be a bit less defensive, see things as they actually are happening. And from that position, we have the possibility of better solutions.
Well, and I'm sure that it changes the way that those two communicate with each other. I mean, if I can't imagine that people purposefully want to humiliate folks and make them feel bad. I would hope not. But if I had ever said something that offended someone, first of all, it would break my heart to know that happened. But if that person brought it to my attention and said, you hurt me when you said this, and this is why, and this is how that made me feel, then the person I would make a note that, okay, when I'm talking to this person in the future, I need to make sure that I don't say this, that I do this. But do you feel that after conversations have been had, that the people who were accused of bullying in the workplace are moving forward with those sensitivities, renewed sensitivity, or are they good for a couple of weeks and then go back to normal?
Right. Well, of course, we can't generalize. And that's why I always talk about extreme personalities. People are so quick to say, oh, he's a bully. Oh, she's a narcissist. Or
right.
She's so controlling. But of course, all these kind of personality traits, they all lie on a kind of a continuum. So some people, who we might consider bullies or tyrants in the workplace, if they're not so extreme, yes, they can learn. Of course they can learn, when things are brought to their attention. But some people on the extreme, of course, no, they never learn. And then it's about damage limitation. Then it's about a whole other direction.
Yeah.
Of course, some people can learn. As you say, sometimes you say something and somebody interprets it or hears it as offensive when that wasn't your intention at all. And those sorts of dynamics, of course, can be corrected, of course, if it comes to your attention. Right. If it doesn't come to your attention, of course, you might be carrying on. But just to say, when you said earlier, it's not anybody's intention to cause somebody harm, but actually, for some people, it is their intention, whether consciously or not. And of course, these are the extreme bullies. Their intention is, in fact, to make people feel bad or insignificant or small. And that's because they're feeling inadequate themselves. And the way they protect themselves is to, project those bad feelings onto people, closest to them.
You talk about that a lot. Your book is all about that, the dynamics and the personalities that, you know, your life and your work are separated, but they meld together because our life experiences create our personalities, and your personality comes with you everywhere, no matter you can modify yourself a little bit when you go to work. I think most of us modify our behavior in the workplace, but you still have those underlying life experiences. So that typically dictates. So what do you do when someone says, I've had enough, I'm at the end of my rope, I can't be treated like this by my boss anymore? What's your advice for that person? What's your guidance? Like, what is the first dialogue that you're having with that person?
Well, wow, let me just go back to the first point you make before I answer the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, your first question is, such a good one. Your first point, really, that, there's an assumption that somehow when people go to work, they kind of leave their sort of emotional sides or personal sides at home, and they come to work and everything is so objective and rational, and all that messiness is left for home. But of course, it's not the case at all. We don't detach from our emotional lives. We bring it everywhere with us. And of course, it colors our perceptions all the time. So if you can imagine, it's not just you, but everyone's bringing their emotional lives into the workplace. So you can imagine there's all these various realities going on simultaneously. There's the actual reality, and then there's your internal reality, what you perceive is going on. So if you can pause for a moment and appreciate that everyone is bringing their internal realities to work with them, then you have to appreciate how difficult it is to navigate all these realities, the actual ones and the imagined ones. But keep in mind, the imagined realities can feel as powerful as the actual ones, sometimes more powerful. All that's at play. So there's no simple solutions to this, but it's useful to acknowledge, if that helps.
Well, and it starts, I think, with conversation.
It has to, because of course conversations and dialogue is the beginning of being able to separate out. What I talk about quite a lot in my book is what's so crucial is to be able to separate out our imagined realities from the actual ones. And that can only happen through dialogue and conversations, checking out what people are really thinking. What are their intentions? What are they actually saying? Have you interpreted things wrongly? Have you misunderstood? It happens all the time. So checking things out, having conversation. Now the problem is at work, of course, is nobody seems to have the time. Once we meet somebody, we conclude who they are, what they're thinking. We're so quick to judge, and we're so quick to put people in pigeonholes, and we're so very slow to allow them out of their pigeonholes once we make a judgment of them. And of course, there isn't that time, to go, what did you mean when you said that? What were you thinking?
But this is how you made me feel when and is it even appropriate? I feel like, is it appropriate to say, you know what, you really hurt me when you said that? Is it appropriate to, I feel like some people don't feel like it's appropriate to talk about feelings in the workplace. I do. I think it's imperative. But a lot of people are like, oh, it's just work. And I'm like, well, it's not just work, because we're human beings producing the work, it's a human dynamic. It's not work life. Our work is a big part of our life. And when you've had a terrible day at work, you come home and it affects your life. It impacts your relationships at home. It impacts your own self-perception. So you can't just say, this is your work and this is your life, and don't get so emotional about work. It's just work. But a lot of people have that attitude.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. You're so right about that. There's so much confusion about that, as if people shouldn't bring feelings into the workplace. Of course, they have strong feelings. The idea that we don't have feelings in the workplace it's just crazy.
Right.
Of course. So, but the question always comes up with what to do with all these strong feelings at work. And course, that's never really even discussed so much.
Right.
Of course, somewhere it has to be managed. Of course, work isn't the place to process feelings. It's not what work is. There are other places,
Yeah.
perhaps your close relationships or your family or other places are there to kind of talk about your feelings and process some of these experiences. But at the same time, we can't ignore that people are not just units of production.
Right.
They come with their thoughts, with their feelings, with their emotional lives. My goodness. So how do we handle them? If we don't give it some space, then people are much more likely to act out those emotions and those feelings destructively at work. So if organizations think they can ignore people's feelings and emotional lives, they're wrong about that. If they're not given some voice, and how much is up for debate, but if it's not kind of understood or given some room for expression, these strong feelings will be expressed in other ways. And this is behind a lot of the destructive behaviors in the workplace, of course.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we're finally at a point where people are starting to talk about mental health and wellness in the workplace. And that's not conversation that we were having, 5, 10 years ago. People weren't really talking about wellness and giving their employees time and space, for mental health. That wasn't in the dialogue. But I think that with COVID and seeing, how emotional people have gotten and how there is, uncertainty and fear and all of these human dynamics, people are starting to realize, okay, we do need to focus on wellness, because I'm sure it is impacting productivity and that impacts the bottom line. So maybe that's when it becomes the priority. Um, but I feel like for people who are in it, is there a way out? Is there a way out of feeling that abuse without leaving or without raising your hand and being now branded as a tattletale? Or, I mean, what is that dynamic? Because when you do raise your hand and ask for help, it's got to change the dynamic between those two folks in the workplace.
Okay. Well, let me stop you again, because you're raising some, a few good points at once.
This is how I always talk to you.
Okay. It's all good. Let me just go back to the original points you made. I don't want to lose them because they're such good ones. And you're very right to say there's more awareness now than ever about mental health in the workplace. And of course, lockdown and COVID has shifted the discourse altogether. And what's happening now, of course, which happened before, and what's new, is that people's needs have come to account. It's not just about the companies and the organizations. It's a bit more in balance now. So employees' well-being are really coming to the front of the conversation, I think, more than ever. So there is such an opportunity to bring this up for discussion. Of course, but people have to recognize, when people talk about people's mental health at work, people still sometimes assume it's almost as if people have mental health problems that they bring to work, rather than acknowledging that actually the problem can be the organization. We have to appreciate these mental health problems in context of their work and the organization itself. So we can't think about individuals' mental health. We also have to think about the mental health of the organization as well. We have to see these problems in context in order to find solutions.
And so if you are witnessing it, if you witness someone being abusive to a coworker or one of their, someone on their team, do you have an obligation to say something?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, if sometimes if somebody is observing an abusive situation, that'll affect them as well. They're holding something in themselves, which is difficult to contain. So again, there has to be a place that they can go to talk about how, in part, how it affects them and where to go. So there always has to be a kind of a place people can go, whether they're the ones themselves who are being harmed or they're witnessing someone being harmed. all that has to be up for discussion. And I think one of the things to say is that, people in companies, they will keep a close eye and see how abusive situations are dealt with. And so the only way that they can be convinced that it's safe to report abuse, either towards a colleague or they're being harmed themselves, if not only they're told, but they actually see that this is a company that takes employees' well-being seriously. And that doesn't come about through any sort of procedure or policy. It becomes about what people see. If people see that people's complaints and concerns and well-being are taken seriously, then they'll feel confident to report these incidents.
Because I've got to imagine that by the time someone musters up enough courage to actually go and say something about it,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't probably typically happen the first time someone feels that they've been offended or treated in an abusive way. It probably happens after months or years, and you finally get to that point where you can't take it anymore and you have to say something.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's typically explosive at that point, because and now if you go and you finally say something because you want something done, and then people say, well, are you sure you weren't reading too much into that? And you know that she's just kind of that way. She talks to everybody like that. And I've personally been through this where I finally said something and then it was dismissed. And I can remember feeling completely betrayed that something wasn't done. Because it had happened so many times on so many levels before I finally said something.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you finally do bring it to light and then it's redirected at, no, it's not that person. It's really just you being overly sensitive. It feels like betrayal. It almost makes it worse. And then what? And now you also feel like there's no correcting this because this was going to be my remedy and this is not going to be the solution. So now what? So then you leave?
That's right. Yeah. Well, what can I say? You've described it so well. I think there'll be a lot of people listening who will really relate to what you've just said. That's precisely how it feels. Like how
Yeah.
you feel when you're not believed. I mean, you said it so well. The wrong response is to be dismissive, is to minimize the problem, is to brush it aside. The right response is to appreciate the immense courage it takes to report an event like this. How terrifying it is, for that person, and acknowledge it. So the right response is, this must have taken a lot of courage. You're so brave to be coming here. I want to hear more. I want to hear more is always the response. I want to hear more. I want to know more. So your job really isn't to judge or to minimize or to brush aside or to make the person feel better. Your job is really to try to understand what's going on in the person. In the first instance, what are they thinking? What's happened to them? You want to understand their perspective, their experience, and that takes time. So rather than leaping to conclusions, take the time to listen.
Agreed. And I think that it's important that people realize if you do have someone coming to you, it's likely been something that they've really struggled with by the time that they are coming to you. And so when you do have someone putting these emotions and all of this in front of you, the one thing that they need above all else would be validation, right?
That's right. That's right. Your job is really, really to understand where they're coming from and what they've been through. So the best response, of course, is to listen and ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Find out what's happening. And, very soon that will get across the company. You want to be seen as an organization that's interested in what's happening to people. interested in their perspectives and interested in their experiences. You don't want to be a company that's be seen to be terrified to face these difficult situations, because that gets across very, very quickly. Very quickly, you can become known as, oh my God, this isn't a company where I can really bring these issues.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly.
Well, and you were talking about it earlier. It's perception. People see it, and if you know that this person went in and already complained about that boss, but they never did anything.
Exactly. That will come across very quickly. And then the next person will think, well, what's the point of my saying anything? Nothing ever happens. So you really want to be seen as a company who takes action, who takes situations very seriously, as difficult as it is. And of course, if you're not equipped to deal with it, find people, bring people into the company who can. Admit that, sometimes, that's sometimes in the past where I've been called on. It's been very good company, but for some reason they don't understand these extreme personalities and how they operate, and they're find themselves sometimes out of their depth. So, get the expertise you need to deal with it.
Well, and we were talking too about perception, and if this has been my experience and it's personal to me, it's true and it's real and it's valid to me. But it's also sometimes what you're calling abuse maybe really isn't abuse, so it's maybe it really is. Well, no, you're just being held really to the same standard that all these other folks are being held to across the organization. And no, we make everybody do that report. That's not just something you're being made to do. And sometimes do you find that you've had conversations with folks who feel abused when maybe it wasn't?
Well, that does happen. And, as people are feeling more entitled to voice their experiences, of course, that's happening more in the workplace as well. So certainly people have come to see me who've been wrongly accused of bullying. And so, that can happen as well. It can be very easy because, of course, remember I was mentioning earlier that people also bring with them to work their earliest experiences. And sometimes people who might have come from backgrounds where perhaps they were harmed in some way in their early life. They come to work sometimes and they almost kind of anticipate being harmed. Through their interpretations of events. I've seen that as well. So, for example, people come to work and perhaps there's a manager who keeps a close eye, perhaps is a bit controlling. Controlling isn't abusive as such, but the person can come to interpret that as bullying. They start to think that they're being watched. They can become almost quite paranoid. This person is watching me because they want to get rid of me, rather than this person is trying to help me, you see. So, it's an example how somebody might be recreating their early lives in the workplace. And they can even do the sorts of things that might invite the abuse. So, for example, if they feel their manager or somebody is harming them or is out to get them, they might react defensively and enter into a argument or a conflict. There is none. So there's so many.
It makes sense. Yeah, I mean, we're people. We've got these emotions.
we're with people. Exactly, we're all people. We all bring this into the workplace. And so, there's, and every situation is different. So there's no way I could generalize, but certainly it's been the case that people have come to me, or I've gone into companies where there have been unfair or wrong accusations made. Sure. And then, it's really important to take the time to investigate that as well. You have to take a more systemic approach. It's really important to interview and talk to everybody involved. And again, try to arrive at some shared reality that everybody can agree with. And it might involve everybody changing their perceptions, or for some people, it means changing their behavior. They have to be very convincing that they're not the person others imagine them to be. So it's.
Yeah, so many dynamics, but this is what you get with people, right?
That's right. People.
Well, and I think too that, in your book, you talk about a lot of different feelings and how these feelings, like paranoia, change the perception of our reality, and how one comment, one gesture, one action can, some people brush it off, some people internalize that and analyze it, and it's because of the personality differences. And I treat people how I want to be treated, and that's how most people treat others. However, we don't all want to be treated the same way. um, Tell me about like control freaks, workplace tyrants, you call them. You were telling me earlier that there was a bully that turned herself in and came to you because she was accused of being a bully, and she didn't like that. She didn't want to be a tyrant or be perceived as a bully. So those conversations, I mean, when you are the person who's being accused, what is that dialogue like, Naomi?
Well, I'll tell you about that case if you're interested. It was a
I
very
know.
interesting story. I mean, she came to me because she was accused of bullying her team. She was in banking, and but she thought she was being unfairly accused. But being who she was, if there was any part she played, she wanted to understand what that might be. In other words, she was genuinely worried that perhaps she was a bully, and that's why she came to see me. But what you have to understand is that people on the extreme end of bullying behavior, they're not likely the sort of people who are going to be seeking my help.
No,
Yeah.
no,
They're not going to be people who think, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? I really need to examine myself more
right.
deeply. They're not going to come. So immediately I knew that this woman, was suspicious of the accusations made against her, and started to investigate it a bit more. And the more we investigated, the more we found out that actually what happened is that when she first had her management job, she thought the best way to manage her team was to give them autonomy, which a lot of people believe in, just give them freedom to do things in their own way. But in fact, one of the things she found out is people were really slipping quite badly behind deadlines. And, in her industry, it was really creating problems. It was really crucial. So when she eventually stepped in with quite a firm hand and started to set some limits and boundaries and say, look, we've got some deadlines to meet, people interpreted her change of behavior as bullying. In other words, you were always so easygoing. That's,
Ah,
you see. So when she stepped in, she was kind of misperceived. It was her change of behavior, really. But by then, of course, the damage had been done because they reported her, to management and HR, and it had already grown out of proportion. So unfortunately, she had to leave. But when she left, and to her next job, she had already processed the situation so that she could genuinely leave that experience behind.
behind.
She also come to recognize how it was that she contributed to the situation, what in fact she had done to contribute to this misunderstanding, which was helpful. Of course, it prepared her for her next job.
Well, and that's not a tyrant or a bully. That's someone who's, I mean, that was just, but I think that abuse has this big, huge umbrella, where it's everything from a comment to battery. I mean, it's just, there's such this huge spectrum that defining abuse is almost impossible, because the feeling of abuse is really personal.
Gosh, it's so true. It's so right. People who feel hurt or feel bad, very quickly can come to feel that they're being abused. And of course, we have to take that seriously because if they're being harmed, we need to know about it. Companies have a responsibility to keep people safe. And if they're not safe, they need to know about it and step in and do something about it. But I guess what you're talking about is people can also misinterpret. And I've seen this as well. People can sometimes misinterpret situations as abusive. For example, some people, if they're being micromanaged extensively, they feel, as I mentioned
It's
earlier,
abused. Yeah.
they think, oh my God, why is he keeping such a close eye on me? Or why is she looking at me all the time? Is she thinking of firing me? So
It's paranoia, yeah.
slip in, and people can kind of convince themselves too. But all of this can be lessened through taking the time to have some conversations.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it all starts with conversation, and that's the reason that we wanted to speak with you today. And like I said, this could be a mini series. We're already at time, but I just, I think that, I think the greatest takeaways here are just that it does start with having productive conversation. And the other is that sometimes you can't fix it, and that's
And that's
typically the best time to go.
Well, can I add something else to that list of what to do? The important thing, and it's what I stress in the book quite a lot, is personal awareness. The more you can understand yourself and what you bring into work from your own past, from your own personal experience, it's important to understand what your blind spots might be and how you might be vulnerable to misinterpreting some situations or reading some situations wrongly. The best approach is when you're making decisions and reacting in the workplace, you really want to react to what is actually happening. And so,
Yeah.
in order to do that, you really need to have that kind of insight to be able to separate what's happening inside you or your own personal and historical past from what's actually happening in the present. And that does take a bit of psychological work, but that
So
usually.
interesting, Naomi. And I appreciate you making time today to talk to our audience. And I'll tell you what, I've already ordered my book. I can't wait for it. And
It's been lovely to chat. Really.
well, a wonderful conversation. And we did put, okay, Naomi did put it, I'm going to put it down here at the bottom so people don't have to dig. There is a link to Naomi's book here. Um, let's see, is that right? Okay, hopefully so. Anyway, The Man Who Mistook His Job for His Life. It's going to be a wonderful book. Naomi Shrahai, thank you for sharing your insight and your voice with us. It's an important one, and I can't wait to read my book.
It's been lovely to talk.
Well,
Okay.
same here. Thanks so much. And folks, feel free to reach out to Naomi. Her LinkedIn profile is up above. And I hope you all have a wonderful week. Take
Okay.
care. Thank you.